Greetings, everyone. My name is Sean Lofton. I am the Artist Services Manager here at Northern Clay Center, as many of you probably know. I'd like to start by thanking everyone for joining us in person and online. We appreciate people who were especially willing to brave the potential for the almighty deluge that was supposed to be coming this way. So thank you very much. I would like to start by letting everyone know this is a lecture that will be associated with an upcoming exhibition, Queer Alchemy. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Sarah Knight. Sarah is a research-based artist whose current work focuses on the reorientation of fragmentary queer narratives and reappropriating the dominant narratives of queer history to highlight the absences of particular voices within the broader history. Sarah received their MFA from Washington University and their BFA from Miles College. Sarah is currently living and working in St. Louis, Missouri. Their work has been shown throughout the U.S., and Knight has participated in a variety of residencies around the country. Sarah is the artist and curator of Queer Alchemy, which opens with a public reception on October 4th from 6 to 8 p.m. I would highly recommend that everybody who has an opportunity comes and checks that out. In addition to Sarah's exhibition, a concurrent exhibition will be opening as well called Pathways, which would be really, really wonderful. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Wingate Foundation, without whose generous support, this exhibition would not be possible. And now, without any further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Sarah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And if you are on Zoom, you cannot see my face, but for those of you in the room, hi, my name is Sarah Knight. And I am here coming from St. Louis to install my show this week, Queer Alchemy, which is made possible not only by the Wingate Foundation and the support of, actually, Wingate Foundation also was the generous supporter of my first residency at the Craft Alliance. So thank you, Wingate Foundation. You got me started on my career path. But also generously through Northern Clay Center with the support of St. Louis Regional Arts Commission, who has given me a grant to help support the making of this work, and the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, who gave me a residency at which I made every single one of these pieces. So I'm coming here from St. Louis, and this show specifically, and the presentation for this show is just going to be about the work that is here at Northern Clay Center and how that body of work developed, and the kind of accumulation of the work that seems like a few different types of series all in one room. That kind of, it creates what I would hope is an alchemical and sort of cohesive dialogue between material and the ceramic process. So on this opening slideshow, I put one of my newer pieces. This is a brand new series of work, which is basically lava lanterns, and they are lava glaze lanterns that are translucent because the glaze chemistry itself is relatively fragile. That pink is, for those of you who are ceramicists, not the pink that comes out of the kiln. You can see a plexiglass light, but the glaze itself is also pink. If you are in person, you will be able to see that in the gallery when we go there later. So to get started, my first slide is the very beginning of my sculptural series. So this is the first piece in the first series that I made beginning last year. And this piece is called To Offer Up a Grain of Sand. And it started with this tiny little sketch that I made on the riverbank of the Huza River out in the Ozarks. It's a place that my family has a tiny little farmhouse at, and I go and I collect my rocks, which you'll see an abundance of and can take some home with you in this gallery. I'm giving my rock collection away because for multiple reasons, but one of those is that please help me, and I have so many rocks. But that first sketch up there on the left is really how this whole series started, and I was just sketching out thoughts and ideas while I was on the riverbank, and I was there right after a storm came through and upturned a couple of the trees that I had grown up with and known really well, and I was looking at their root systems and realizing that a lot of those kind of big old roots were entangled in some really kind of beautiful druzy quartz and had kind of started to absorb the geology. And I really got my mind turning about like those systems that we don't see, those natural systems that make up the kind of underside of our entire landscape that then kind of create a network of the way that things grow and move. So this first piece was that first exploration with using crushed up gravel and crushed up rocks in addition to whole rock inclusions. And you can see that those pink Those pink kind of coral-like structures are actually druzy quartz that have gone through a cone 6 oxidation firing. So as a reference, every single one of my pieces just goes through cone 6 oxidation. No, nothing fancy, electric kiln, single firing, except for one piece that I reglazed. That was the first time I'd ever reglazed a piece. So if you have any questions about glazes or inclusions, it comes with the caveat of, I know what it does in cone 6 oxidation. Okay, cool. On the next slide, I'm kind of going to introduce you to a little bit of my natural influences here. And this was actually the first photo that I took when I got to Houston, when I moved there for a 6-month residency that ended up being 9 months because I extended. They have a very interesting ecology there. I was primarily comfortable with talking more about geology and its connections to queerness and that conceptual lens of trying to tie queerness and transness to something that felt very permanent, but at the same time understanding that there is a fragility in the formation of identity and the way that we see our world. And I really wanted to lean into the natural world as we understand it and the biological elements that kind of overtake human ideas of humanity and ideas of language and the way that we move about the world. There are things that kind of defy that language. And I really think that there's some amazing overlap between those things. But on a very formal level, I'm constantly just absorbing whatever landscape I'm in and really trying to just take it all in. And that just means going on a lot of walks. It means taking a lot of photos. It means taking soil samples and seeing what they do when embedded in clay. And so you can kind of see the similarities in the way that my work is beginning to become a little bit more meldable and droopy and a little bit more, it has arms to it now, there's kind of lichenous materials on it. It looks more like a body. It's a very bodily thing. And that surprised me. That's something I kind of steered away from for a while, is that biomorphic element. But it became something I really truly learned to embrace because I realized that not only was I responding to it, I was able to better track the way that I experienced the landscape. So in the next slide is just a close-up of that first piece. And this is lichen, what eats around itself. I am a bit of a nerd with etymology, which is the study of language. And lichen, the etymological origin of lichen actually does mean the thing that eats around itself. So that's the, I believe, Latin word for it. And so that is what I ended up titling the piece. And on the right is lichen patterns that I found in Banner, Wyoming through the Gentile Foundation when I did a residency there in the summer of 2022. There were beautiful lichen formations, like colors I didn't even know that could actually exist together in a landscape, especially in the middle of summer. It was 100 degrees. It was absolutely like I thought everything would be fried, but there was this beautiful sort of, ground level ecology that I wasn't even considering. And there are actually rocks from the Banner area that have dried lichen on them in the exhibition that still retain their color. But this was kind of the inspiration for this. And this is actually commercial glaze over melted rocks embedded in the clay. But if anyone needs glaze combinations, I can get those to you. So here are a few formal things that ended up influencing the development of the installation in the gallery. Those ended up being the bald cypress trees that are all over the hill country in Texas and specifically down in southern Texas in Houston. This is Pedernales Falls State Park, and this is a little bit farther west out in Texas. And I did a big sort of weekend trip out there just to take in the formal scenery there. And I think it was my only trip during my residency in Houston that I actually took and wasn't spent in my studio. So the next slide kind of shows a bit more of how that influenced my work. This on the left is bald cypress, quite literally titled after the thing that influenced it. My titles become less and less abstract as I make more and more work because I can see more and more direct connections. But I was really fascinated by the fact that the tree relied on the balancing of roots that it was balancing of rocks and its roots that it was kind of slowly pulling at as it began to lean over. These trees were growing on a gravel bed, so inevitably as erosion happened, the trees would slowly fall over but stay alive because they were, embedded. but they would use kind of the rocks that were embedded in the roots to keep themselves from fully collapsing. And so it was this really fascinating landscape that looked like it was sort of storm struck, but they were really thriving trees, just learning to lean against their change in orientation. And while that has a lot of, kind of conceptual depth when considering kind of the formation and growth of, natural patterns, I really was fascinated by just how adaptable things can be in fragile landscapes. And here's another close-up of the other side of that piece and a actual close-up photo of a root absorbing one of the many rocks that are similar to the things that I use in my sculptures. So these rocks are primarily Ozark Druzy quartz and limestone conglomerates, and they are from the Cambrian era, and they are about 500 million years old. So on a kind of humbling level, as ceramic artists, we do understand that the things we work with, even if they are highly refined, have this really deep and almost unknowable history. And we are kind of in that privileged position of being able to touch it and manipulate it and have a collaborative moment with it. So within sculptures, I'm trying to recreate that slow passage of time as it relates to my understanding of how identity is formed. And I think that this piece really began to embody that most fully. And here are some raw clay samples from the bayou out in Houston, Texas. I did a lot of wading through mud and trying to find clay. Houston is entirely built on clay, which is the reason for a lot of its potholes, but also the reason why it has such a great sort of ceramic history. And these are all clay samples, raw clay samples sourced from the same meter of river. So they're all right next to each other. I took them all back and fired them, and they all fired to very different colors, which I really liked. And primarily, I'm kind of attributing that to iron content. I didn't fire them up to 6. I just missed them to kind of see what their porosity level was. And it was actually just straight out of the ground usable clay, which I don't get a lot of, having lived in an urban environment. And this was still an urban environment that I thought was really fascinating. And on the right is actually a just shot of my studio in Houston, Texas during my residency. And in that shot, I do have some Sager fired, low fire, basic bowl shapes that have mica sigillata on them. And so if you ever see a very low fire, Sager fired thing that is super shiny, it is mica powder in terracig, which is basically OM4 slaked down in water. So you too can do this. These were basically wrapped up like baked potatoes in newspaper and tinfoil and fired at 022. And you just take them out and unwrap them like a baked potato, and you have this beautiful black fired sort of surface texture. So I really, really like that. I did actually make my own ink out of the bisque fired and crushed clay, and that is that bright orange that you're seeing. And so that, with a little bit of an acrylic binder, also adheres to low fire clay. And so those pieces are on the wall, all have that incorporated in them. And here's more shots of how I do test tiles. Some of these don't have labels on the back. Like a beautiful test tile will tell you what it was fired to, what the layers are, which phases they are. After a while, I do give up. It's a very disorganized system, but I kind of am relying on memory. But for the most part, my test tiles end up being just quick little things to kind of test out an idea without worrying about organizational systems. They all end up kind of in a box or on a wall in my studio, and they come out as needed, but you can kind of see how they influence my work in this piece on the right. This is transient, and if you take a look at it, you can kind of see which test tiles I used in it. And this piece did surprise me because I wasn't expecting it to be as vibrant as it was. I am fascinated in just using ceramics processes a bit to the left of their intended use. So I put porcelain slip over glazes that I knew would off gas and bubble up to create a lichen effect and to kind of create this crackly, expansive foaming effect. And I do it a bit intuitively, but there is a bit of a system in terms of the additives that I use, knowing that I work at Cone 6. So anything that is silicon carbide, I know that I can add that to any sort of matte glaze or semi-matte glaze and get a foaming glaze out of it. And I can also add crushed rock into my slip powders, or into my slip covers to get melted rock inclusions out of that as well. So there are a lot of things that I do intentionally wrong in ceramics, not to kind of go like, oh, I'm doing it wrong, but just to see what happens next, because I really don't want to be fully aware of the outcome of my pieces. I think that doesn't do a service to the materials that I work with, especially considering some of them are 500 million years old. And I always want to be a beginner when working with ceramics. I never want to be like, okay, and another one, like exactly like the one before it. If I am ever trying to recreate something, it is because I broke the first one. And that is it. But the next series, yes, okay, so this piece is one of the final ones I made at my residency. And this is a piece that is becoming a little bit more biological. The colors you might have noticed throughout the series have gone from more naturalistic and kind of as found out of the ground and more into these artificial colors. I was leaning really heavily into the idea of the artificial versus natural. I think as craft artists, we understand that there is a fake dichotomy between those two things. We work with the natural, and by working with it, we make it artificial, but its value system changes very arbitrarily based on the art market and how people perceive art versus craft. But I take those kind of value systems and I like to examine them in relationship to how they can actually be damaging or how they can be exploited by someone like myself who is queer and trans and would like to embed those queer and trans histories into something bigger that is undeniably larger than society itself. So by using things that are artificial and claiming that they're natural, and vice versa, by turning something natural like a stone into an artificial fusion, I am able to basically make it undeniable that there's a level of flux and transmutation in everything that we encounter, and to define it by its one word or a single set of languages and not really have another way of looking at it is potentially not the best way for anyone to go about seeing the world. So these sculptures being a little bit bodily and a little bit kind of maybe a little oozy is my way of drawing people in, but also having them search for something that maybe they don't have the language to describe. And so in this exhibition, there are actually the first series of vessels that I've ever made. These vessels are in thanks in part to a good friend and mentor of mine who is just a academic master of moon jars and who has just been saying like you should just start making vessels. Just try and see what happens if you have a simple surface to work on, a simple spherical surface. What would happen? And turns out what happens is I work highly with texture, and it just feels like not a blank canvas, but a simple and friendly form on which I can kind of experiment with new techniques. So Magnolia Jar is the only piece I've ever recreated twice. And that is because the first one sold at a benefit auction before I had a chance to sit with it and look at it. So the one in the gallery is actually the Redux, the second version of it, because I wanted to actually look at it and photograph it and kind of have time with it before I figure out, how to turn this into a series. So this is entirely Cone 6 black clay. And in this one, I'm using Laguna's brown bear clay? Nope, B3 brown. The lower manganese content clay. And this glaze is basically a simple commercial glaze with a little bit of steel powder mixed in. It sounds really fancy, but it's not. You can put ungalvanized steel in the kiln, always ungalvanized. Galvanized steel will off gas and is extremely toxic, but ungalvanized steel almost detempers in the kiln. So if you put sheet steel in the kiln, which I used in a previous series of work where I was forming stone and melting stone in the kiln, you end up with fragments of crumbly steel that you can then crush up and put in your glazes. And it does have iridescent properties. So lots of fun. This is the next little moon jar piece that I made. And this is a lichen jar. It is titled Aptly. There is a lot of lichen out in Houston, and I was working specifically with trying to play with the colors and textures that I was seeing. So again, this is intentionally doing things a bit in reverse. The green on top of some of the texture that you're seeing is actually porcelain slip, which takes pigment really well. So this is for those of you who are ceramic artists, this is US Pigments, lime green, pigment, which I think is a little bit more limey than Mason stain. I'm sorry, Mason stain. But they make really good reds and they make really good greens. And I mix that in with a commercial porcelain because I can't mix porcelain to save my life. And I put it on top of off-gassing glazes so that it does create that crackling effect. The iridescent one is specifically the Cosmos glaze by Amico because I am afraid of mixing iridescent glazes in my studio because of what they might contain. So that is what is that called? Dark Star, Black Star Cosmos glaze. It's a really beautiful iridescent glaze, but that is on top of a glaze that contains silicon carbide powder. So it creates a foaming off gas. And there are plenty of recipes that are lava glaze or crater glazes on glazy.org that are foaming and off gas glazes that have silicon carbide powder in them. And I highly recommend using one of those glaze recipes if you want to try them out, because they're much more user-friendly than the one that I do use. Although if you want that recipe, I can get it for you.
We actually have a question that maybe actually would be good for right now.
Yeah.
In the Zoom room. Emily wanted to know, how did you start to / do you now safely test non-traditional process clays in an electric kiln? Sort of wondering how people like myself who only have access to a shared studio kiln find ways to push the work while being cautious of the impact on others.
Yes, so there are a couple ways to do that. If you are super hyper wanting to be cautious of other people's work in the kiln and you don't have the ability to say, hey, I'd love to just run my own Bisford glaze firing to do a test, you can create a sagger in your kiln. And that is basically, you can create for most of us, we have access to rolling out a slab built container in which you can run test tiles through that will minimize the impact of those fumes on your elements, on your thermocouple, on any other work that might be in the kiln. The other thing to be aware of is that a environment on your electric kiln, if you are in an enclosed space, is extremely important. That's less important if you have a kiln shed that is not attached to your studio building or any sort of office space. But if you don't have an environment, I would recommend maybe thinking about using a studio that has an outdoor kiln. And that is for pretty much any electric firing. If you have a gas kiln, you are outside. And I have not run any of my materials through a gas kiln in reduction. So I have no idea what they would do. I assume that it would be a much more dramatic effect of off-gassing and of complete color change for some of the things that I use. But for wild clay specifically, to address that question, I have never encountered an issue with wild clay doing anything other than burning off organics in small amounts. I've never encountered an issue of wild clay exploding, of it catching fire, of it off-gassing something ridiculous. If you are just going through the process of processing wild clay, which is slaking out any sort of weird debris that might be inorganic or plasticine, you're okay to test wild clay in an electric kiln. Just make sure that if you have a studio manager, they're well aware that you're using that clay and you are not running it past BIS temperatures if you don't know if it'll melt. But always having a little sagger with a bottom, sides, and a little top will keep anything kind of in your kiln safer from anything that you're doing. Speaking of kilns, this is a before and after, just to kind of show you the inability of me to kind of gauge what's going to happen. While you can see there are some kind of, I would say, crumbly inclusions, I know that those are pieces of stone that will melt. So they're embedded into the clay or into the clay itself. For the most part, it's a relatively matte and unassuming process when I put it in the kiln. I truly do not know what's going to happen. I really thought it was going to be much more green than it ended up being. And I had no idea I was going to get that light kind of tan iridescent color out of my glazes. And that is something that is just a series of testing. If you are a more hesitant person than I am, test tiles are the way to go. But if you want to commit to it on a big piece, you can commit to it on a big piece. And I'm a proponent of reglazing. I've had to do it once before, and there's nothing wrong with it. So this is a shot just to show you, specifically if you're going to see the exhibition and kind of the accumulation of work in the exhibition, is that all of these pieces happen concurrently. You might recognize all three of these pieces as pieces from different series. So my vessel series, my lantern series, and my sculpture series, they all happened at the same time. And when I think back about it, like on those series, I do feel like they happened at different times, but this is shots that I take to remind myself that I was working on three things currently that all do speak to each other in their own making, even if they do look very different once they're finished. But it's primarily a way for me to mine my own practice and kind of go back to where I was at the time. So if you are, an artist working with a lot all at one time and it feels like it's not coming together, it doesn't have to. You made it. You are sometimes the missing link in your work. And I really encourage you to consider yourself in as a presence in the final series that you make. Also, it's to show you that silica sand. Always use silica sand. So I'm going to get into a series of translucent porcelain bodies. And I'm not going to go into the lore of it, but I went to grad school thinking I was going to be a painter. That didn't end up happening because I couldn't get into a painting elective and I ended up in ceramics. And I very quickly found out that you can paint in ceramics. And so I made it hard on myself and I was like, I'm going to use porcelain slip because why would I use any other easily usable material? So I was very fortunate that I got a workshop residency at Watershed in the summer of 2022. And that was my first time using Laguna's porcelain doll slip, which is a very highly translucent white porcelain. Don't look into the naming of doll slips. It's a problematic area, but the white porcelain doll slip, which is the least assuming name that you will find, is super highly translucent, and it is just past vitrified at cone 6. So it slightly slumps over itself, and it has almost a latexy surface when it's fired. And I was using it to get back into my painting practice. I wanted to make translucent porcelain paintings, and I wanted to do it in a free-form way that I would be quick. It would be 30-second paintings on a plaster bat with porcelain slip that I would peel up and form. And I didn't have a plan for those paintings, but I just wanted to experiment with color. And so, because color is kind of this infinite opportunity, I limited myself to colors of the sky for the first series that I was using. And so a lot of the pieces that I ended up making were colors of the sky that I saw outside my residency in Houston, because they have beautiful sunsets down there in Texas. So that was my limiting factor for that. But that was the first shard that begat a whole series that you'll see in my exhibition. That is these guys. So this is the Radiant Aberrant series, and it is ceramic, porcelain, glaze, and lighting. And to demystify the lighting, these are puck lights, under cabinet puck lights you can get off of Amazon. Very simple, super bright, and very low heat and easy to use in installations. But this is a ceramic frame that is covered in a lava glaze pigmented with looks like chrome. Nope, it's cobalt carb. And on it, I have just basically glaze adhered a porcelain painting that I made. And to make these pieces, I actually make the porcelain painting in its entirety and fire it to cone 6 before it goes on my bisque frame and gets glazed again, just to make sure that it doesn't break, and that it's the size that I need it for the frame itself. This is the only time I'm ever working with shrinkage rates, and that is a rare thing for me to do. But for the most part, once that porcelain is fully fired, it's not going to warp or shift at all when it goes back onto a stoneware body. And here are a few more series using that glaze as a translucent medium. So I wanted to experiment with just using glaze as a painting medium, but at the same time, the lava glaze that I use is pretty fragile. So I made a sort of ceramic frame base that I could use for my wall-mounted works, and then glaze the heck out of them. 6 or 7 coats of this glaze, and it actually behaves very well, and it takes pigment very, very well. This is that orange again. Wait, did I talk about the orange? I talked about the green. That is the US Pigments green. That is the US Pigments orange. And that I think is about 8%. So it's not 15, 20%. It's a really highly pigmented color that works really well in glazes. And I haven't noticed that it affects the glaze quality at all, at least in a matte glaze. I have not tested them with a gloss glaze yet, but they do have translucent qualities. And this series specifically, and the Radiant Aberrant series, is my first, it's actually not my first, but my first intentional foray into using light as a medium. I think if we're thinking about the opposite of the earth and its just massive tangible presence, the intangibility of light is something that I'm just beginning to work with on a conceptual and material level. Less so color, but more so just the idea that you can have something that technically you cannot touch and can only experience through being with. And then the physicality of clay, which I think that I rely on as a very familiar object. So I am almost afraid of light as a medium because it is something that is very difficult to express unless you are in person and witnessing it, because there is that experience of being with it in your body that I think is difficult to compare with ceramics. I feel like as ceramic artists, we understand what a piece might feel like or act like in space if we see it in 2 dimensions, but light is something that is completely different and new to me. And here's something that I love. This is the Hall of Minerals at the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences. And I really love their display mechanisms. I, in previous installations, have made completely black rooms with underlit plexiglass pedestals. But for this show, I really wanted to push the work and less the installation. There's still plenty of installation elements in it, but I took the inspiration for each piece from the colors that I was experiencing that seemed like they were completely artificial. It almost was like, how can this possibly exist in nature, especially underground, in a place where they weren't made in light? So why would they have this color outside of chemical properties? And really trying to link that specifically to the intangibility of light and kind of this hidden space behind the paintings that I was making. But at the end of the day, I think that this kind of experience in the Hall of Minerals and really connecting to the geochemical properties of rocks has influenced even my painting. And I think that it's something that I'm just beginning to kind of recognize that connection with. And then this, I believe this is the last slide, yeah. So this is just 3 of my little lantern guys. So that I'm calling them lava lamps because it's a lava glaze and it's a lamp. And I did not grow up in the 70s, but they are lava lamps. This series is just the one where I am able to play quickly and loosely with glaze and light as material and really trying to honor the ceramic process and its potential and possibilities. But I also want to return to craft as function. I really did not enter the ceramics world with a functional background or any sort of ability to make vessels or any sort of ability to make things that served function or had kind of a cultural functional purpose. So my kind of backdoor way of doing that is to go full circle with light and color and strange materials. And eventually, I believe this series is going to kind of grow back into my sculptures and potentially even branch into different media. But it is the newest series in the body of work that I've been making that I feel like I still have not fully fleshed out. And I am kind of excited with the infinite possibilities of forms like this and their potential to be bigger, smaller, multiple, and kind of infinite in their iteration that I think for the longest time, ironically, I did not recognize was possible, especially as someone who came to ceramics not as a potter. So that kind of infinite possibility of remaking something that is just slightly different every time the bug has finally gotten me. So this is my way back into it. But yes, this is my final series, and these guys are also in the exhibition as well. And yeah, so that is my final slide. And I would love to open up any questions that people have. And then after questions, those of you who are in person, you are more than welcome to come into the gallery and see the actual work in person. Because all of those pieces in the slideshow they're here. So yeah.
How do you crush your rock?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I am going to market this. There is a product on eBay called the Mighty Mill. It is for prospecting but I actually found out about it. It's a tiny little angle grinder attached rock crusher.
Oh.
And it is primarily used for prospecting, but I found out about it through a watercolor artist who makes her own watercolors using rocks from the Lake Michigan area, actually. So she doesn't have to fire her rocks, but she puts them right in, she powderizes it, sifts it, goes through the tedious process of molding it, turning it into a watercolor pigment, which I feel like I would never have the patience to do, which is why I use ink. But these are really easy, maybe 15-pound, $250 pieces of equipment. They come in 30 different colors. Mine is hot pink. And I love her so much. And if you are at all interested in doing any sort of ceramic or unrelated rock crushing, I highly recommend these guys. They're super friendly. They're a little bit scary loud, but they're super friendly and easy to use and really safe if you're using a respirator. And they're just a really quick way to kind of like, add something new to your art practice.
And probably made in the USA.
Yeah, that too.
I just found this really great.
You're welcome, Mighty
The
Mill.
angle grinder is the power mechanism?
It is. So you attach an angle. The hardest part about it is getting the angle grinder on it. Yes, and that's just me and my inability to read directions. But the angle grinder attaches to it, and inside are 3 what look like chain link loops. It's a really rudimentary system in there that just smack the rock around until it powderizes, and it's a relatively quick process. But it has a little like chimney entranceway that you put your rock into, and you hold down with a gasket and you turn on, and it will make a really loud noise like the world's worst blender for a bit, or like a spoon in the garbage disposal is the best. 50 spoons in the garbage disposal is what it sounds like for 10 seconds, and then you have a crunch rock.
Any kind of rock, or does it have to be like sedimentary?
It can be any kind of rock. The only ones I'd steer away from is, and you can find this on mindat.org, which is the chemical breakdown of every rock you've ever known. Anything that has the word pyre in it. So pyrite, fool's gold, that thing will spark and set itself on fire. I would look up any crystals. I just steer away from crystals because, first of all, calcium carbonate at the least worst, and at the most worst, you're off-gassing some pretty terrible stuff in the kiln, and you don't know what that powder really is. Rocks, because they're so kind of contaminated and inert, respirator is usually all you really need for that. But yeah, any type of rock with a little research.
Excluding uranium.
Yeah, I mean, if you have
Almost
that, generally, if you have that, the only thing I would tell the US government is if you have uranium. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you had apertures, and some of you, not in this slide, where you had the before and the after, and like the size of the hole looked big, and then in the after it like shrunk up
Yes.
a lot. Is that just the movement of the glaze, or is your
It is the
clay in the
movement of the
rock?
clay body. So my dark clay body, that guy specifically, and that is a reclaimed clay body that has a lot of that dark clay body in it. Usually darker clay bodies with a higher iron content tend to be more plastic and have less grog, and so they'll shrink more. That particular clay body is a high shrinkage rate. That was for its cone-6 stoneware. And I don't mind it's too much, but it does, it does a little bit of a lean in the kiln if you're not careful about your wall thickness and all that fun stuff. But yeah, it's
You
primarily
had like a tube with a hole in the end, and then it just seemed like it kind of totally collapsed.
Yeah, so if there's in the sculptural element,
Yeah.
yes. So if there is,
Second before and after picture.
ooh, yeah, it's the second before and after picture. Let's see here. Ah, yes. Okay,
The green and pink one.
the green and pink one. Oh, yeah. So this guy right here.
An elephant nose.
Oh, yeah. So that right there is the foaming glaze foaming over that hole.
Okay.
Yes.
The whole, like the holes you see in the second one are just like bubbles at first, like tiny bubbles.
Yes. Yeah. So actually, yes, that is exactly what they are.
Cool.
Yeah, for lack of a better technical term. That little like pipe hole there, that was me ensuring that that tube was actually hollow because connecting it ended up being a little bit of a beast while it was wet. So I just left it open. I wanted to make sure that both potential closed sides were getting an air hole in it, and I didn't time my dry correctly enough to poke a hole in it, so I just left it. And then I put a foaming glaze over it after it was bisqued and I knew it wouldn't explode, and just covered that hole up.
So you put the rocks in at the I mean, they're going through the firing.
They are, yeah.
What if they don't shrink at the same rate as clay? What happens?
You will see that in my exhibition, but if you actually go back to let's go back to lichen jar, not lichen jar, but lichen what eats around itself. The close-up image of it. And can I show you actually the shrinkage cracks? Okay, so you can actually see the shrinkage cracks. Maybe not as well. I should have included an image of that. So the clay does shrink around the rocks and will crack. And in some cases, it will crack enough that a piece of clay will come off. That's usually something I try to adhere with the foaming glaze, which is a really good way to fill in gaps and cracks. Leaf, because I do like that kind of rupturing moment if I can balance it correctly. And if I absolutely cannot get it to stay back on piece, epoxy sculpt.
You mean after the fact, you might
Yeah.
put foaming glaze on a second firing or something?
So I try to strategically put foaming or kind of a really lichenous glaze over part of the rock. So each part of each rock has a little bit of glaze overlap on it because I know it'll stick it together at least enough for me to get it out of the glaze firing and get some epoxy clay on it. And it's just usually if the rock wiggles around a bit in there, it's never really fallen out before.
Okay.
But again, epoxy clay.
Maybe on that note, it might be a good idea to go into the gallery then, so we can
Sure.
maybe see more of what you're talking about in person.
Yeah.
Sorry, participants, we do appreciate you joining us. Again, as a reminder, October 4th from 6 to 8 p.m. is the public reception. That will be the first time that Sarah's work will be open to the public, and the show will be up for another 6 weeks after that, I believe, starting on that following Saturday, or that Saturday, so the 5th.
Yeah, and the show is actually open to the public starting this Saturday, right? The reception's on the 4th?
That is correct.
Yes, and also Pathways Community and Clay is
Yeah.
open at the same
Yeah,
time.
Sure is.
Gorgeous group of people. Yes.